Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, the 29th of April 2024. Today we're looking at the rail transformation programme. This is obviously a huge, important programme for the future of the rail network, which has failed over the years and has been costing the taxpayer and causing misery for passengers for a number of years. Everybody agrees that the system is in desperate need of reform, and the Department for Transport has set up the rail transformation programme to try and deliver on those complex reforms, but it is a very high risk timetable. The NEO report, which we're grateful for, shows that there isn't a really clear plan yet, and it has not yet delivered. So we're really keen to hear from witnesses today, get into the detail of where they're at, where they hope to be, and hope for some honest answers about what the possible problems are along the way in achieving the government's aims. And we want to, obviously, in this committee we've often raised the fact that passengers seem to be at the bottom of the scale, so we want to really hear what's going to be happening for passengers as we discuss this with our witnesses. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have, of course, Bernadette Kelly, who's the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Transport, and she's joined by, just make sure I've got your titles right, by the Conrad Bailey, who's the Director General for Rail Strategy and Services, or the Rail Strategy and Services Group at the Department for Transport. And they're also joined by the Interim Director General for Rail Infrastructure, who's Anit Chandarana, and Andrew Haines, who's the Chief Executive of Network Rail and the Great British Railways Transformation Team Lead, which initials are GBRTT. Gets exciting, doesn't it, working in transport? So perhaps you could just explain actually first, Mr. Haines, how you can manage to do both jobs and what that role as transition team lead involves.
Well, when the white paper was published in 2021, the government and the Department for Transport identified that they needed a vehicle to start mobilising, so that once legislation had been passed, you had you'd been through the necessary investigations into what would the model be for operations, actually setting up some of the capability, setting up priorities, and so we were commissioned, basically because Network Rail is the largest beast. If you didn't commission something out of Network Rail, then you would face all the transfer costs and delays, contracts, 40,000 people, all the assets into a new entity. So we're the logical home to create it out of. So we've been doing that. We've had actually Anit wears two hats here because much of this time Anit is here because he was the lead director on my behalf, so working full time on that right up until last August when he went to work at the Department for Transport. Okay. So that's how I was able to do it, because Anit was full time on that, and we've had a team working on the detailed plan, working alongside the department on legislation, delivering some early benefits around fares, ticketed retailing, bringing together industry experts to actually mobilise rail revenue recovery, so that actually we were attracting more people to rail.
Okay.
So a whole host of things in that area, which we're happy to talk about.
And we're going to get into the whole governance issues around it, because that was pretty key to some of the challenges that it's had so far. Thank you for that. So before we go into the main session, we've just got a couple of issues to raise with you at the top, and I want to ask Anne-Marie Morris MP to kick off.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, Dame Bernadette, you'll be aware that our one railway line, which takes us down to the southwest, was severely disrupted following the storms in Dawlish, which are now, I think, almost 10 years ago, just beyond. And when the wall came down, the government committed that it would do everything that it took to put it back together again and make that South West Peninsula rail line bulletproof, future-proofed. Of the 5 phases, 4 have largely been completed. The 5th one, which is the most difficult one, by the Teignmouth Cliffs, the government is committed to it. The challenge, however, is the funding that needs to be forthcoming, and where we have got to, as you will know, is the design phase. That has to be put in place by June at the very latest, because that design phase requires drainage trials, and those have to be installed before we get to the winter months when you get the maximum rainfall. Otherwise, the trial is ineffective. Now, the decision to commit that money, which I believe is part of the Network North money, has been delayed now 2 months in a row. Can you give me some comfort that at the next meeting, which is expected in May, the green light will be given for that money? Because if it doesn't happen then, frankly, we can't then ensure that in June we can then start rolling out that plan and putting in place the necessary drainage mechanism for the study.
So I'm obviously I'm aware of the scheme, which has come up a number of times at these hearings in the past, and as you say, 4 phases of the work complete, and as you also say, commitments included in Network North. I can't give you comfort at this point because decisions ultimately on funding are for ministers, and until those decisions are taken, then I can't sort of say anything further about them at this committee. But obviously, the business case is with the ministers, and they're well aware of the importance of the scheme.
Can I just, for your benefit, make it clear that if we don't do this now, then the whole programme is delayed by a year, and any railway line is only as resilient as its weakest link, and the longer we leave this, the more vulnerable that railway line is, which would mean a bit of a waste of all the money and effort that's gone in so far. If I could just ask you to press the case with ministers and also with Treasury, your colleagues in Treasury, I would be most grateful.
Okay, I noted, and I think the seasonality issues are ones that I'm sure will be well understood by colleagues and ministers. So I take the point.
Appreciate it.
Since Ms Morris is going to be beating a path to the Minister in the lobby tonight, to her lobby there as well. Thank you very much for that. I just wanted to pick up on your response, your Treasury Minute response to our PAC report, our report on HS2 and Euston.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, at the point when the Prime Minister announced that Euston was going to finish at phase 1, he talked about a redirected £36 billion, that's in 2023 prices, of course, to Network North. And we asked if you would commit to updating Parliament and the public indeed with a list of projects by region that we funded through the money redirected to Network North. You came back with a response, which is, I have to say, a masterful response in that it told us, yes, you agreed with us, but not exactly how. So I just wanted to press you on how often you will be reporting and updating the list of projects that will be funded through Network North.
Okay, so I thought the question was about a slightly different issue, so apologies, Chair, I haven't looked into detail on this point. Obviously, we set out a fairly detailed list of Network North commitments in the initial announcement. I don't think we've got a formal plan to do an annual report or similar on that, but I would expect ministers to want to give full information to Parliament on the progress that we're making. So I'm sure we'll find a mechanism to do that. But as I say, I don't think there's a formally agreed sort of way of doing that at the moment.
It would be helpful because, I mean, one of the things here is about finding it in one place, following the money through. I mean, our good colleagues at the National Audit Office can do that, but it's kind of, that's a resource that, well, available to the public in a sense, is not easy for access.
So, I mean, obviously I can sort of talk the committee through the things that have already been announced, which is the £2 bus fare extension, the further £1 billion for BSIPs, the additional funding for city regional transport settlements, for highways maintenance, and the local transport fund have all been announcements. And say we should give some thought, I think, to how we bring that together and sort of provide, as it were, a sort of clear account for Parliament.
If I can gently say, of course, it would help you and or correspondence team or the team who draft parliamentary answers might be helped enormously if the information is provided up front to 650, a chunk of the 650 people in this place who would want to be following very closely where that money is spent. And how you obviously, you've talked about the business cases that will have in response to us that will have to be made. So there will be some time lag on some of these pledges, which we do understand, but it would be helpful, I think, if that time frame could be set out. And also, how if you could tell us now how you're aiming to look at how you will demonstrate value for money, because that's a chunk of money that's going to transport projects, some of which are not yet to be defined, and we need to know that money is not just being spent for headline reasons, but it's actually going to deliver results for passengers.
Of course. So on the time frame, obviously the 36 billion released from the from HS2 was due to be spent over a significant period of time, not in the short term, and the spending will broadly need to sort of follow the same profile. Obviously, we're having detailed discussions with the Treasury about the exact sum in any given year, but that is, we expect broadly to spend the money in the time frame we would have spent it on HS2, so that's quite significant. So if you take the local transport fund, the highways maintenance allocations, they're over 11 years, reflecting that time frame. On value for money, then obviously we'll be looking at each of the specific business cases for the programmes and projects as they go through decision making in just the same way we would any other transport investment. So I expect them to be subject to exactly the same process of business case appraisal and value for money appraisal. So that will simply apply, as I say, as decisions come live on all of the projects and programmes set out in Network North, which, as you say, run from sort of quite detailed developed schemes to very, very much more long-term and less developed ones.
If we could perhaps offline have a conversation of how it's reported to Parliament, because there's a lot of interest. People want to follow their own transport projects, but we as a committee want to look at the overall money and how that's spent. It'll be our successor committee, or committees indeed, because of the length of time that will follow this through.
I'd be very happy to take that back to the department and then to come back to the committee.
I have to say credit to the DFTs that we have many complaints about you, but one thing is that you are very willing to report to Parliament in a way that we find useful. So thank you for that commitment. Mr Lake.
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, any of the money that will no longer be spent on HS2, will any of it be spent on projects in Wales?
So there is a significant commitment around North Wales electrification set out in Network North. I think that was the most material of the sort of Welsh investment set out in Network North. So yes is the answer.
Thank you very much, Mr Lake. So we now move into our main session to look at the rail transformation programme and dig into how that's going and what pitfalls it's coming across. So I'm going to ask Mr Mark Francois MP to kick off.
Thank you, Dame Meg. Kelly, if I could refer you to page 10 of the report. So this is the summary element of the report and then the conclusions. So what you might call the bottom line of it. So if we go to paragraph 16 on page 10, I'm just going to read you the final sentence. I quote, "With key parts of reform now paused until the next Parliament, long-standing issues on the railway remain, such as its financial stability and affordability, culture, and the service provided for passengers." Sorry, there were two sentences. DfT is not yet set up to secure value for money from its work to reform rail. Well, you've had several years to have a run at this. That's a fairly damning indictment, isn't it? After all this effort, the department's not yet set up to secure value for money from its work to reform the rail industry.
So I think we would acknowledge that we haven't been able to progress the full sort of scope of rail reform as originally intended and as set out in the white paper published in 2021. The report is obviously a detailed assessment of that, and we accept its findings. I think there are quite a number of factors which have caused rail reform to take longer than we intended, and actually this goes back to May 2018, which of course was the sort of event, the timetable challenges that we experienced then was the event that started all of this work on rail reform. Quite a lot has happened, I guess, in the interim period, which has caused some challenges for this programme. The pandemic obviously both interrupted work and changed fundamentally some of the challenges we face, especially around sustainable funding for the railway. Inflation actually has made many things more challenging, including workforce reform. We've seen ministerial changes, and we haven't been able to secure the legislative slot that ideally, which is needed in order to fully progress reform. So I acknowledge the challenges and the time that it has taken, and that we are not as far ahead as we would like to be on rail reform. And of course, as a consequence of that, not all of the benefits and therefore value for money has been secured. However, I do think I would also want to emphasise, firstly, that I think the fundamental analysis underpinning rail reform remains, I think, sound and correct and broadly accepted. I think we have made good progress in a number of areas. Obviously, establishing Great British Railways transition team in shadow form was important. We've published a bill now for legislative scrutiny. We've delivered benefits around flexible season tickets and simplification. And there is work ongoing now to deliver other benefits that can be delivered without legislation. But I would accept that obviously we have not been able to establish GBR in its full form and therefore drive all of the reform that was intended.
Well, thank you. I mean, just again, this is the NAO's report, not ours, but we're here to ask questions on it.
Agreed by the department.
Thank you. So, the opening sentence of that same paragraph 16, quote, "The rail sector's performance for passengers and the taxpayer is not good enough, and has not been for some time. DfT has identified key problems that need to be addressed, but has not been able to translate this into a programme it could implement. The overall theme that runs through this report is that everything seems to be, in effect, on hold.
Well, I don't agree that everything is on hold. I think we have made progress and are continuing to make progress. Where I acknowledge we have not been able to make the progress intended is in the establishment of Great British Railways, which requires legislation. And obviously there's always, ultimately whether legislation is secured is a matter of sort of collective government decision making. So I think we have made progress. But I think, as I say, we acknowledge that there is still more to do, and I think certainly ministers would agree that there is still a really pressing imperative to drive improvements in how the railway performs, both for passengers and for taxpayers.
Fine, well then let me just give you one specific example. I'm an Eastern Region MP, so Greater Anglia is the main railway company through my constituency. I've had run-ins with them down the years, but I've always given them credit for the fact they kept the trains running very well through COVID. I mean, I'm the first to give them praise for that. But look, I mean, the Prime Minister at the party conference last October announced a whole bunch of transport projects that could follow on from the money that was saved by the cancellation of the northern leg of HS2. We're not here to debate the merits of that decision today, but the knock-on was that there was going to be money to fund a whole range of other projects. But very few of them have actually started. We're nearly in May, this is back in October. So just as one example from my own region, the proposed junctions at Ely and Hawley, they would be a massive asset to the east of England. They'd enable more freight to go cross-country, not up the main line to London, where it can cause congestion for passenger trains, including ones from Southend. I can vouch for that. The number of times we've sat at Shenfield, I'm sorry, we've got to let a freight train go through. So here's just one example of two very important junctions, and apparently Network Rail haven't for 6 months been allowed to take any action on this, spend any money or make any progress. And there are dozens of these. So why is that?
So, well, I may ask
Mr. Haines
Andrew and Anit to say more about Ely Junction, because I'm not familiar with the close details of that project, and I'm sure they will be more so. I would just say that in terms of, it goes really slightly to the question that the Chair asked at the beginning of this hearing as well. The money released from HS2 is intended to be spent on a very wide range of programmes and projects, and some of those we have announced funding for. In other cases, it's a combination of firstly needing, as I say, to profile spend, so it sort of broadly matches the pace at which savings are released from HS2. And the second thing is the sort of readiness of schemes and projects for delivery as well. So we have to take those into account. It was never, I think, the Prime Minister's intention to say that we were going to do all of the things in Network North immediately. There were always going to have to be a rolling programme of delivery of all of those commitments and schemes. But I don't know whether either Andrew or Anit wishes to say more. Can I just explain, by the way, because there are some slight differences in Anit's role relative to how you described it at the beginning, Chair, and I just wonder if it's sensible for me to, just for the record, Anit was, until last week, leading our work on rail infrastructure in DfT on secondment from Network Rail, where prior to that he had been leading the work on Great British Railways transition team. So he's particularly well placed to answer questions on that. He's now returned to Network Rail, and we have a new Director General, Alex Haines, leading our rail services. So I'll clarify that for the record.
Title, I didn't realise Mr. Chandarana.
But I wondered if, I don't know whether who's best to talk about Ely specifically.
Ely is a great scheme. It's got a very strong business case because of the decarbonisation benefits of freight. Every freight train takes about 80 lorries off the road, which is why it's got such a strong case. But as the Permanent Secretary said, we're waiting the profiling of the release of funding. Obviously, the my understanding is that the parts of the HS2 programme that were cancelled were not actually have a high spending profile for a number of years. and so the amount of money that's available in the immediate term
Well,
released by that.
You said the analysis is compelling. I mean, the business cost ratio is almost 5 to 1. So on paper, it looks as if this is, to use colloquialism, a bit of a slam dunk. But it all seems to be taking an inordinate amount of time to work its way through the system. In my experience, Hugh Merriman's a very diligent, very proactive rail minister. He's not a man who's frightened to take decisions. So why is this taking so long?
It's to do with the release of funding, the profile, which I think is yet to be agreed.
Could we explain a bit more to the committee about why it's taking so long to release the money?
Well, what we're needing to do for all of the Network North commitments is agree with Treasury an appropriate profile. As I say, not all of that 36 billion is available to spend now. It's available to spend over a significant period of time. So we're in active discussions with the Treasury about how much is available and released to be spent now, and then ministers will have to take a view on the prioritisation of those schemes and programmes which are ready.
So we're arguing in layman's English, we're arguing about which years we're going to spend the money in. Got that.
Yep.
But a lot of that is going to be subject to a post-election public expenditure review, whoever wins. So doesn't that really mean that even if you can take decisions about these major junctions now, there's a risk that some of that will then be interrupted by a public expenditure review 9 months later?
Well, look, future spending reviews are for future governments, and I can't really comment on what might or might not happen in those. I can only explain, as I'm seeking to do to the committee, why we are having to implement the commitments to Network North in a phased way.
You're sticking to the spending profile HS2.
We're broadly sticking to that.
Look,
and then, as I say,
in fairness, sorry to cut across you, but we're always tight for time. I mean, in fairness, you've recently released £5 million to rebuild Wickford Station, which I've been arguing for 2 years, and Hugh Merriman took a decision. So you can take some decisions, but it's these kind of longer-term big junctions that seem to be the problem. Mr. Haines, after 3 years of debate, you've recently reopened Blount's Wood pedestrian level crossing in my patch. So thank you for that on the record. But again, that wasn't a major junction. I do find sometimes, if I'm honest, Network Rail is a bit of a giant bureaucracy. So why does it take Network Rail so long to take these decisions?
So look, we can be big and clunky, and that's why we've created a regional structure to have us to be much more accountable. And that's why I fundamentally believe we need rail reform, because the Network Rail is segregated and separated from the passenger and freight revenues, and that creates the wrong incentives currently. But it's important to recognise that when it comes to enhancements, all enhancements are funded directly by the department on a ministerial decision. So our regulatory settlement is for the maintenance and renewal of the railway, and if it's an enhancement, and I have no financial delegation at all. So that does mean then we have to compete with other public spending commitments and other decisions even within transport.
I think another of the themes in the report that I'll hand back to the chair is, because our current structure is so complicated, you end up with a bit of paralysis by analysis, as the Army calls it. And everyone, whenever you want to get something done, everyone points at someone else and says we're waiting for them to decide.
It's a very fair observation.
That is a fair observation.
It is a fair observation, absolutely. But often the pointing is true, because nobody does have. The point is, very few people have their hands on all the levers, and it can be immensely frustrating.
Which brings me back to where I came in. All the more reason to rationalise it, and all the more frustration at the fact that 3 years on we haven't really done that. Anyway, point made. Back to the chair. Dame Meg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Francois. Anne-Marie Morris, MP.
Thank you, Chair. So, the Department for Transport set up the Rail Transformation Board. That then created the Great British Railway Transition Team to work with the two government departments, Treasury and Transport, and the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. Quite a few very challenging stakeholders with many different interests. Why were the governance arrangements, and I'm looking at you, Mr. Bailey, so ineffective at getting those stakeholders to agree scope and delivery plans?
If I maybe start by just summarising the governance arrangements. So when we, following the launch of the white paper in summer 2021, we established and used the Rail Transformation Board. That was something that brought together colleagues from GBRTT.
So can we just spell it out?
Great British Railways Transition Team, as well as critically the Treasury and the Infrastructure Projects Authority. As we moved forward, and we were looking at that point to introduce legislation in the third session, it was very clear that we wanted to establish a shadow body, a shadow Great British Railways. That was the Great British Railways Transition Team. We wanted to set that up on a legal basis, and so that body needed its own governance in accordance with normal sort of government practice. It was an independent legal entity. It had an independent chair within the Network Rail structure. We used the Transition Board very much to try and bring together both Treasury officials, draw on the expertise of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, and those of us who were working to take forward the reforms. I think it's a fair challenge that board was not able, in and of itself, to bring together and get complete alignment between ourselves and the Treasury in particular. It did help us establish that overall programme and drive the programme forward. But that, in terms of actually bringing the Treasury on board, that was not sufficient in and of itself.
I think the Chair is going to ask questions about the Treasury in due course, so we can just focus on the general concept of good governance. What is it that you are now proposing to do to make it work more effectively? You effectively admitted it doesn't work. Your challenge being you've got almost competing governance structures, if you like, for the different parties involved. What are you going to do to make the governance overall, integrating the independent governance arrangements of the key stakeholders, work? Because otherwise, without key roles and responsibilities, we're not going to get anywhere.
So within I don't recognise that we have had challenges between the relationship between the Great British Railways Transition Team governance and the Rail Transformation Board arrangements that as were. My sense is actually that relationship has been a very collaborative one and one that's worked well. I attend as an observer the Great British Railways Transition Board. Members of that team also attend the Rail Transformation Board. The challenge, as I say, in terms of the governance and bringing stakeholders together has been specifically in relation, I think, more to the relationship with the Treasury. In terms of going forward, we've changed the way we're looking at the programme. We're trying to run it now as very much a portfolio of different projects so that nothing gets held back. We can move forward on those things that we can without having legislation. We've created a rail reform board, which again has the right people round the table, but with very clear accountabilities both for the individual projects but also within our wider departmental governance. So it's very much plugged into that, and that then obviously flows up to the Treasury where Treasury approvals are needed.
Will you have oversight of what you just described to make sure it works in practice?
Yes. My sense is we've got a much clearer oversight, but as I say, the particular challenges that I think we struggled to deal with through the Rail Transformation Board were that ensuring cross-government alignment.
Okay. So to achieve this, given that we are not in a position right now to have legislation, you've chosen to focus on a number of different aspects. The employment piece was one, which I'm not going to touch on, but culture was another. Culture is one of the most difficult things to change. And given that you could not legislate, and given effectively you had a cake and you could only deal with the currants and the nuts and not deal with the flour, how on earth did you think, and how do you think you are going to affect that culture change, and how are you going to describe the culture change that you're looking for?
So in terms of culture change, we've done a number of things. We've worked with leaders across the sector to identify a kind of cultural framework for the sector, things we can agree on. The importance of the customer would be a really obvious and straightforward example. We've done a lot to encourage interchange between organisations, so I'm sure Anit will say more in a moment, but a lot of the people from the Great British Railways Transition Team have come from many different organisations. Anit's secondment into DFT, and indeed Alex Haines' secondment done more recently are all about getting that cultural interchange, and we've been doing that at every level, taking that down into our sort of leadership to bring people together to work on joint projects, to begin to get that culture of collaboration, which is really essential. We've also set up collaborative sort of leadership programs across the sector.
So when you talk about culture change, you're not talking about changing the culture, you're talking about delivering collaboration, or have I got that wrong?
One of the elements of the culture we need to change is collaboration. Another, I would say, is absolutely this focus on the passenger and on the freight user of the railway. Value for money would be another area.
And has anybody articulated what the culture you're trying to achieve looks like? Because if you don't know what you're shooting for, it's going to be very hard to deliver.
Absolutely. As I say, we've set out a cultural framework, which I guess is best summarised actually in the strapline of the Great British Railways Transition Team, which is a better, simpler railway.
Better, simpler
For
railway.
everyone.
For everyone in Britain. Yeah. And it may want to pick up on...
I'm not sure that's a culture.
So if I can describe what we've been doing in the GBR transition team as a way of trying to explain that, because one of the reasons for setting up that group of people was to start bringing about that culture change. I think it's worth taking a step back and saying that the culture we have in this industry is a function of how it is set up. It's not just because there are bad people working in this industry. It's one of the big findings that Keith brought about. If you take, for example, Network Rail, which has been set up for 30 years to think about assets, or train operators who are very simply asked to look at revenue and not the cost base. That's what drives the culture and the incentives. So when we set up GBR Transition Team, one of the things we have striven to do is to look at how do we bring people from the industry together that haven't worked across the piece. So we've attracted people from across 17 different railway organisations, from every owning group. And when we start putting people together and they start seeing the full picture of the P&L, from revenue to cost to outcomes, they start taking decisions which are best for the whole system rather than the individual parts of their system. And that begins to drive a different culture. And as well as that, what we've been able to do in the transition team is create a much more diverse group of people. So if you look at the makeup of the transition team, we've got 52% of women in there, 26% of ethnic minorities, and 5% of people with stated disabilities. And that creates a culture where decisions are taken with that. It's much more representative of the customer base that uses the railways. So, and that experience we have used to create the cultural framework, which has been shared with all parts of the industry, and all parts of the industry are signing up to that culture. But what you're absolutely right in recognising is culture change is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time to get to that right culture change. But what we have shown through the work in the GBR transition team is when you start looking at the railway as a whole and you start creating a desire for the people in the railway to make decisions across that whole railway, thinking about customers, passengers, freight, and the taxpayer, it does begin to change the culture. There is also no doubt that ultimately, to get to that cultural change, we will need the creation of Great British Railways to drive that agenda. But these are beginning steps that we're taking to try and create change.
So you're prioritising culture change while recognising you can't actually deliver culture change until you get legislation through. So It sounds to me like you've got aspiration, you've got a plan, but there's a key plank missing. So how realistically are you going to drive forward without this piece of legislation to change the culture? And how will you measure whether or not you've achieved what you set out to achieve?
So I do think we can make inroads into it. I agree we can't do the complete job without the legislation and creating GBR, but I do think we can make inroads. So some of the things we're concentrating on now, for example, in Anglia, we are trialling, we're starting a pilot with the train operating company in Anglia and Network Rail about how do they create better collaboration and better decisions across their space to deliver passenger outcomes. The ultimate test of whether we're achieving those better passenger outcomes will be passenger satisfaction and passenger advocacy, and that's how we will measure whether we've achieved those outcomes. And ultimately, passengers and freight companies will vote with their pound notes because they'll bring the revenue into the organisation. That's the ultimate measure for us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Morris. And I'm delighted to welcome Ian Stewart MP, who is the chair, of course, of the Transport Select Committee, who's guesting with us today. Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Chair. As you will know, that my committee is doing the pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft rail reform bill, and I think several of you will be appearing before us in the fullness of time. But I just wanted to pick up one theme that's already emerging from the evidence we've received. And that is, while most stakeholders in the industry are comfortable with Network Rail becoming the legal entity as a base for GBR, there's a deep concern that the culture of Network Rail will just move over. And you'll have a new building with a new nameplate on the door, but not much else changing. How can you make sure that GBR is not Network Rail 2.0?
Well, first thing I would say, I would share that concern. It would be a massive missed opportunity if GBR was some reinvention of Network Rail. But I think it's really important to emphasise what Anit has just said. Cultures are not created by accident. And the Network Rail culture is one that is pretty predictable. If you say, here's a regulated entity, you please the regulator, you get more money if you negotiate with the government. If passenger numbers go through the floor with COVID, you get better performance payments. If freight goes up and down, you're largely held harmless. What it does is creates an entity that is fundamentally interested in assets and in engineering and not in the outcomes of the railway. The work that we've done as part of GBRT to create a single P&L, we are already using in Network Rail to start to change the culture, to get people to realise that if they choose to spend money on X instead of Y and that harms passenger outcomes, ultimately that's harming the viability of the system as well as disenfranchising passengers. But not only have we never had that whole P&L perspective, all the incentives of Network Rail don't drive you to be consumer out. So people act very rationally, and however much you bring in a new chief executive, actually it's very hard to change that when the day-to-day incentives are like that. GBR will be measured critically on that whole P&L, so that people will be making decisions in the interest of what actually works for the user of the railway, passenger and freight, and the taxpayer. And that's fundamental. If you don't, we sometimes talk about culture if it's some sort of ethereal thing that lands, and it doesn't. It's driven by the basic incentives in the business, and that's why I'm so passionate about GBR being whole profit and loss based, because that's the single biggest thing you can do. You can incentivize people, the signals you send them, you can regulate them according to system outcomes and not asset outcomes.
Thank you. And picking up Anit's point, you are making initial steps to try and improve the reporting lines, the culture within GBRTT. The creation of GBR is potentially still some way off. So what tangibly else can you do now to improve the situation? There have been various internal reviews that have concluded there's unclear and duplicated reporting lines between yourselves and the DFT. So who can take charge of that and improve it before we get to GBR's creation?
So, Ian, if this is about what we can do out in the industry, there's a couple of examples that I can talk through. As we look forward, and in the period between now and getting legislation, we've alighted on what we're calling some key focus areas, and some examples of that is business planning. So today, business planning in the industry happens in quite siloed spaces. What we're looking to do is introduce integrated business planning before we get to legislation, which means that the folks who work in DFT, for example, looking at operating business planning, are working with colleagues from Network Rail and trying to understand and effectively try and bring out through that business planning process that integrated P&L that Andrew talks about, so that we can start looking at the decisions that we're taking and do they actually deliver better outcomes for the system, or just better outcomes for the individual organisations that sit in there. And of course, the integrated business P&L is a tool that helps us do that. I talked about the track and train collaboration that we are looking to do to use Anglia as a pilot for can we make better decisions in an integrated fashion, notwithstanding we haven't got legislation, so that we start showing the benefits of taking those integrated decisions and start showing people that they can make those decisions. There are some real challenges in some of that. When people act rationally, for example, in a shareholder-driven business, how we create some return for those shareholders at the same time as for the public sector. You may also have been talking about the relationship between GBR transition team and the DFT. And actually, I think the process we now have, where we have annual business planning process between us and the department, where we agree on an annual basis what is the transition team being specifically commissioned to do, and what is the budget that goes specifically with that, and then we are monitored on that, are the steps we've taken to improve how we, as a transition team and DFT, work together.
One final question for this section. Could you just explain to me the appointment or the secondment of Alex Haines from Scotland into the department, and just how his appointment is designed to improve these relationships?
Of course, yeah. I think that's probably sensible for me to respond to. So we've carried out an internal reorganisation of parts of our work in DFT. It goes beyond rail, actually, but it includes reorganising our rail responsibilities. That's essentially meaning that Conrad's responsibility in the future will be for the sort of wider strategic issues relating to rail, as well as wider public transport and local transport issues, which will allow, I hope, him to drive closer integration on that local transport front. Alex Haines is going to lead our work on essentially rail services and operations, so our contracting arrangements and our infrastructure clienting of Network Rail within the department. What I hope Alex will bring, obviously, is the enormous experience he has of running an integrated system in Scotland to our work now in the department, and ultimately, when GBR is established, into GBR. So I'm really pleased, actually, that we've been able to bring Alex in on secondment, as I say, to bring that experience to bear now, both on the day-to-day operational work we are doing, but also on our transition to GBR.
Thank you very much for now, Mr. Stewart. So Bernadette, one of the challenges you had at the beginning was you and the Treasury weren't aligned at the beginning. You had some disagreements. You're an experienced permanent secretary. You're dealing with colleagues, who are experienced in the Treasury. How did it get to the point that you kicked off without having got agreement with the Treasury about some of the mechanisms for instance, setting fares and maximising rail revenue and managing costs?
Well, the White Paper had collective agreement. All ministers and the then Chancellor,
ministers
now
agreed,
Prime Minister,
agreed,
and officials had all signed off on, obviously, the rail reform White Paper.
What went wrong?
Well, I think, as with all White Papers, it set out broad direction and it set out detail in some areas, but in other areas it didn't set out all of the detail because that was part of the ongoing work of the reform programme. I think it's fair to say then, as we got into some of that detail, it became clear that there were differences of view between ourselves and Treasury on, what I would call important but, sort of relatively technical issues. For example, the role of GBR versus the role of commercial operators in setting some aspects of fares, for example, and things of that sort. And, it's quite common in complex policy areas, and particularly complex policy areas which also have a significant financial impact on the government's finances, for us to, for there to be a sort of lively debate, as it were, between Treasury and departments as we try and work those through. So certainly that was true of this programme. I don't think it's particularly sort of exceptional for that to be the case. As I say, I think there were lots and lots of issues where, we in Treasury bat issues back and forth.
But surely, look, the Department for Transport, you've been doing this a long while. You yourself have got a long track record, not just as permanent secretary, but previous in the department. I mean, who sets the fares and managing costs. These are not issues that are, I mean, they may be high level for a white paper, but surely there'd have been some work underneath
There was
that.
work, and I mean, I expect Conrad can say a bit more about that. But as I say, sometimes, you know, you go into quite a lot of detail, and these debates can get quite detailed as well. One thing I would say is I think we recognised, I think it was around 2022, and an IPA review certainly highlighted that we needed this alignment in order to be better in order for us to make progress. And certainly,
This alignment, you mean Treasury and DFT alignment?
Treasury and DFT. And
Sorry,
I
thought, I mean, I know I have great respect for the Infrastructure Projects Authority, but I thought it was blindingly obvious that you need alignment between Treasury and the DFT.
Indeed. And we were working it through, and we continue to work it through. And I would say now there is much greater alignment between us and Treasury on a whole host of issues, partly because current ministers have taken sort of in some ways slightly different views on those issues. We've seen lots of ministerial changes through this programme. So I think that alignment is pretty good now, but I would acknowledge that there were challenges at various points in this programme. We had to work quite hard to resolve those.
It's pretty good now. Mr. Bailey, what else needs to be resolved? Where are it's pretty good, but not 100%. So what else needs to be resolved?
In terms of areas that I think we've made really good progress, we've agreed a revenue incentive mechanism which we put into the commercial base of the national rail contracts, which is designed to drive back passenger numbers and revenue, sort of harnessing the private sector. We've made really strong.
Interesting. Just unpack that a little bit for us. What does that mean to the passenger?
So what it means is that under the national rail contracts previously, we took within government all the revenue and cost risk. What we've done is we've now agreed a sort of target level, which if the operator manages to drive revenues and passenger numbers above that, they will get a small share of the benefit. And if it falls down, then they lose a bit. But it obviously helps incentivise their teams in that space. Another example would be open access, where we've been working with the regulator and Network Rail to identify access opportunities which could be better utilised to make sure.
You say access as in the rail companies having access to the lines?
This is in terms of open access, so operators that are not funded by the department. And then I guess the third area where I point to that we've made real progress is we've moved forward on the pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft bill, which has been agreed across government as well.
What issues?
So the issues that are outstanding, I think, is when we establish GBR, I think there will be a range of issues around the level of its independence versus the extent to which, given how much of the cost of the railway it will be responsible for, how much is delegated, the sort of the funding arrangements there. I think in terms of the future commercial model, one of the areas we have had a debate is the extent to which the private sector is in a position to take more of the revenue risk or not, depending on the market conditions. So I think those will be areas where we've still got, for example, significant work to do. And I guess at the heart of it is a discussion about how much responsibility you provide to GBR to really drive things versus what powers we need to reserve to government. And I think that tension is actually one that's really grown out of COVID. So Keith Williams in his original team had a secondee from the Treasury. We were very conscious of the need to get this alignment throughout. But I think post-COVID, as the Secretary of State said a number of times, that need for Treasury control on the funding of the railway has been that much greater, and I think that's what goes to the heart of most of the debates.
Okay, we'll watch this with interest, because in the end, if the Treasury isn't with you, you're not going to get very far, are you? So anyway, I think we may delve into this a bit more, but I'm going to now turn back to Mr. Stewart, Chair of the Treasury's, Chair of the Transport. Don't
give me additional powers. Don't know where we'd end up with that. I'd like to turn to the question of government subsidy for the railway. Income for railways effectively comes from two sources: from those who pay to use it, in whatever guise that is, and from government subsidy. During the pandemic, for various very obvious and understandable reasons, the subsidy level soared, and it's now anticipated to fall. What is a sustainable level of subsidy for the railways? What sort of split between fare box and subsidy are you envisaging?
Well, ultimately, that's a political choice. So there has always been some subsidy for the railway. which may be a combination of subsidy for rail operations, i.e. the gap between fare income and service costs, and funding for Network Rail to maintain and operate the infrastructure. So there has always been a level of subsidy that, as you rightly say, was much, much higher during COVID because revenues collapsed, but we maintained services at a reasonably high level. What we're now seeing is certainly on the sort of operating costs side, as revenues recover, the sort of level of subsidy is starting to diminish, though it's still sort of significantly higher than it was a decade ago. There was a point where, of course, we had an operating surplus on the railway, which is not the case anymore. I think it's a political choice what is a sustainable level, ultimately. Current ministers are very clear that the level of funding and subsidy for the railway is not a sustainable level, and therefore we need to do two things. We need to increase revenues and we need to reduce costs, and really rail reform is seeking to do both of those things. But in the end, it is a choice. There is no one level that I could identify as sustainable. That is something for ministers to determine.
I should just be clear that the bell is not, we're not having to leave for a vote. The sitting is suspended. Someone's late for work.
So train me.
Mr. Stewart.
If I could just
I wouldn't mind, though, Meg, but it's all about getting more people back to work.
On that, you identified there the two objectives of growing revenues and controlling costs. Which of the two is more important? Which is the primary focus of?
Well, I think you need
work?
to do both. I'm not sure it's like, which is my favourite.
But is it 50-50?
Anyway,
is one more important than the other?
So I think we're very clear that the long-term solution must be driving up revenues and passenger numbers. So we're making the most of the asset we have nationally in the railway. However, there are many places where we believe that it is possible to drive cost out of the cost base of the railway, and that will be made much more easy by having a more integrated approach and actually being able to view the railway's finances in a sort of whole picture. That's why one of the real priorities for us with rail reform has been looking at this whole P&L. At the moment, we're beginning to get that in a way that you can begin to get some insights, but there's further to go. And obviously, once you've got Great British Railways created, then you've got even more of a tool there to really drive out those benefits. But revenues and passengers are clearly the absolute priority.
Yeah. I mean, what you don't want to do is drive revenues at a cost that completely outweighs the revenue. And yet, for the last 30 years, nobody in the sector has been able to say, right, the cost, the true cost, the system cost of doing that revenue initiative, if it involves infrastructure or train, is X. And therefore, you end up with no sense of the net cost, and that's what we can just about start to do now in the last few months for the first time in 30 years, and that's why, you know, to Conrad's point, we're in a much better place, I think, to drive revenue in an affordable way, which has got to be a better way to do it.
My colleagues will touch on the cost savings in a minute, but I just want to ask one further question on growing revenue. We are starting to see passenger numbers recover. But it's not uniform. Yeah. The off-peak tourist type of traveller is probably above pre-pandemic levels, but the business and commuter numbers remain becalmed, and that's where the industry gains a lot of its traditional revenue. What forecasts are you making for the growth of passenger numbers in those different sectors, and then how that then translates to revenues?
So at the moment, we have a range of forecasts. It's still very hard to tell where numbers are heading. I think our sense, as you refer to, is that the leisure market is a new and growing market. In a number of areas, it's already exceeding the pre-COVID levels. I think business travel in particular is an area which traditionally provided real financial benefit to the railway. That we just are not seeing that come back. One of the reasons it's quite hard to really get underneath the forecasts at the moment is because of the industrial action. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to know what the sort of core passenger behaviour is. But clearly, as we see, I think more and more people returning to working from an office, we are seeing, I think, that growth beginning. And there are very good examples of where we're seeing parts of the railway exceeding expectations. So the Elizabeth line is a really good example where you can see that demand is up. But at the moment, particularly because of that industrial relations picture, it's very hard to know kind of where the natural level of recovery is. What we're doing about it in the meantime is looking at areas where we can trial and do different things. So we've had a number of rail fare sales, as you'll be aware. They have delivered real benefit both to passengers, but also we think introducing new people to rail, and those are the sorts of things that we've been looking at.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. Permanent Secretary, when you agreed that the 2021 spending review, that you would plan that you would make savings of 2.6 billion for the 1.4 billion of cost of the rail reform budget was 1.4 billion. You were going to make 2.6 billion. We're now in 24-25. Will you have a chance of meeting that 2.6 billion, given that you're behind?
No, we don't expect to achieve all the savings forecast.
So why did you agree to it so readily in 2021?
Well, I think when we were agreeing to it, we were making assumptions about the pace of progress on legislation and other matters, and obviously we didn't at that point.
So is legislation the biggest reason for not?
Well, it's one of the reasons we can't realise the full benefits, because we can't drive the full reform. And certainly some elements of workforce reform have also been challenging to deliver. So I think it was a reasonable but ambitious target. We haven't achieved it. We've achieved savings of 2 billion, so we've undershot. We've also, though, of course, spent less than anticipated on reform, so 400 million, I think, rather than 1.2 billion forecast. So both savings and costs are lower than anticipated at the time of the white paper.
What was the impact on the rest of your budget of not having made the savings target?
So it's not that material. I mean, it's material, 0.6 billion, but in the great scheme of DfT finances, and bearing in mind the fact that we have not spent all of the costs, we haven't incurred all the costs of rail reform, I don't think it's been a major sort of factor in terms of DfT budgets in the wider sense. I mean, the much bigger issues there for us have been around inflation. And of course, there are significant financial implications from industrial action, though they impact principally on revenue, which sits on the Treasury's books. So they have had an impact. And one of the things that Conrad and team have had to do is challenge, particularly on our annual business planning with the train operators, to ensure that costs are being really tightly managed, just as Andrew Haines has to drive cost efficiencies in Network Rail. But as I say, I don't think it is something that we've managed this.
You're trimming this with efficiencies, basically.
I think,
So no big project's been stopped, Mr. Bailey.
So I think just worth being clear that our spending review settlement in 2021, the Treasury settlement expected us to look at the costs and the savings from rail reform alongside the passenger service budget. And so actually, because the costs have been lower overall within the SR period, in fact, we have not faced a financial pressure because of rail reform, because the net position between the two is actually lower. None of that changes the fact that we desperately need to really deliver those cost savings to make sure the railway is sustainable in the long term.
And obviously, you've got another spending review, which will realistically, depending exactly on the time of an election, but given an election hasn't happened yet, is likely to be delayed into 2025. So you're presumably working up your numbers for that, and that will depend partly on legislation going through. And also change of government might happen.
Well, I mean, it's hard to, obviously there are many unknowns between now and 2025, but the key thing that we are focusing on are, as Conrad says, firstly, really tightly managing that cost base through annual business planning round with train operators, and driving forward with reform wherever we can.
Okay. Mr. Benlay can be.
Thank you, dear Meg. Dear Bernadette, you've mentioned there about some of the conversations you've had to have with rail operating companies and to try and keep costs tight. And in the NAO report in paragraph 11, it also mentions that you recently amended contracts with the train operating companies to introduce a mechanism to better incentivise operators to increase revenues. How has it gone so far, and when do we anticipate knowing whether these efforts have been successful or not?
Yeah. So, as I just described how the mechanism works, obviously. The initial signs in terms of what we're hearing from operators is that it is changing the focus of their management and their teams. They're seeing more of that focus on really driving up ridership and revenue. We've not yet had sufficient data back to really answer that question. I would imagine that we'll need at least sort of 6 months of allowing this to run before we'll start to be able to tell whether it's delivering significant benefit.
Thank you very much. Anne-Marie Morris, MP.
Thank you very much indeed. We have some very interesting issues about passenger service, and my colleague, Mr. Francois, has already raised the challenge as to what is it we are going to see that is going to make a difference for passengers. You've talked, I'm pleased to hear, Mr. Bailey, about putting passengers, as in getting effectively revenue up rather than cutting the cost, as your priority. But this whole programme is being delayed because we can't get the legislation through. The white paper, much of what was promised in that, effectively has had to go by the board. What can we expect to see within the next 6 months which will actually improve the passenger experience?
So things we have been working on that should deliver over the next 6 months. So rolling out more pay-as-you-go in the south of east of England. GBR, Great British Railways Transition Team, have agreed a plan to begin that process of rolling out and trialling pay-as-you-go for customers in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. We are looking at mobile pay-as-you-go technology and trials across the network. So those are some examples. I've talked about the Great British Rail sales that we have done to date. I'm sure we will continue to look at further opportunities for those. And probably the other area I should touch on is we've done an accessibility audit of all the stations across the network. And one of the things we are now working on, again with the Great British Railways Transition Team, is to make sure that data is available to the public so people can understand the baseline of where we're starting from, so we can make further improvements. So those are some of the examples.
Okay, but those are projects, they're outputs, they're not outcomes. The overall outcome is a happy passenger, the trains are on time, they arrive, when it's expected, you've got the cart going down, selling the teas and coffees. There are some pretty basic things that matter much more to passengers than all of the projects that you've described. So what are you going to do to improve the quality and to make sure we actually get delivered the journey experience that passengers expect?
So I would argue that the accessibility experience is a very critical one for many users.
It's not the only one.
It's absolutely not the only one. I think what you're pointing at is the importance of us really focusing in on performance and making sure that the railway runs to time. All our research tells us that the thing that customers care most about is their train going to turn up and is it going to go on time?
What are you going to do about that?
So what are we doing on that? So we're doing a number of things. We're working with colleagues in Network Rail and in the operators to really focus on those operators where performance has been particularly challenging. So maybe give a number of examples. We've worked with the Transpennine Express to ensure that they are able to reintroduce rest day working, which has led to a better performance. We're obviously continuing to work very hard to hold Avanti West Coast to account for its performance. If you look on the routes out of Paddington on the Great West Main Line,
I know that
there is indeed, of course. Then there's a huge amount of work going on between Andrew's team and Great Western Railways to make sure that we are not only trying to improve performance in the first place, but when things do go wrong, people have a better experience and the recovery is faster. I don't know, Andrew, you might want to add a bit about that example.
Mr. Haines, are you going to give me some comfort? Because most of the time, and I come up every week, it's late, and it's very late.
And we had to resist the temptation for us all to give our worst rail experience. So Ms. Morris gets a free pass on that one. But Mr. Haines, how is it? Tell us how it's going to get better for actual passengers.
It's only comfort I didn't get past the police at the at security without having my ear bent. So very much aware, very much aware of that at the moment. And look, if I look particularly on the western route out of Paddington, which has been one of our two worst performing routes, we're investing very heavily in asset performance, so renewing close to life expired assets. We've had a lot of problems with drainage. It sounds very dull and boring, but actually a railway is built on drains, particularly when you have the sort of exceptional weather we've had in the last 12 months. So if something like a points failure, for example, very often would be caused by poor drainage, because that creates a dip in the track, and then the bounce effect can either cause a cracked rail or indeed a point to come out of alignment.
How are you going to solve them?
So we're investing in additional drainage teams, or in additional track teams, replacing assets earlier, upgrade. We've put 30 million additional pounds into track renewals, because what we've realised is, particularly with the Elizabeth line, that critical corridor, very often people can get a decent journey as far as Reading, and then they get delayed there. So a very, very strong financial investment, but also then working very, very closely with Great Western Railways on how we respond, look after passengers when things do go wrong. Very recently we had a very nasty issue with at Ealing Broadway where a trespasser went the wrong side of a bridge. But actually you can't stop that with the number of bridges we have, but how we work with the police to respond to that, how we looked after passengers about that. We've still got lessons to learn on that, but we're making good progress. And I'm meeting again with the Chief Constable of the British Transport Police next week to talk about those incidents.
How are you measuring passenger satisfaction so you can actually test whether or not what you're doing is making a difference?
So, number of ways. We have a wavelength survey, so that we have joint results every 4 weeks. We have monitors at Paddington Station, for example, just the button pressing, and it'd be amazing how many people, I was taken aback at just how many people are prepared to use that. We do mystery shopping for a lot of our services in that regard. And trust me, people are not slow at coming forward with feedback. Quite rightly, they're challenging, particularly when we let people down on a systematic basis, and that's been our problem at Western.
Okay,
and we also benefit from transport focus as well in terms of their insights, the sort of passenger champions within the system.
Okay, so they are the passenger champions, but they alone do not know what passengers actually want. So what stakeholder engagement are you actually undertaking to ensure you really understand, other than what we all understand to be the obvious, being on time? What is it that they want, given the constraints which we've, I think, begun to see, which is people use railways in a very different way to the way they used before, and you and Mr. Bailey have said that it's quite hard to work out where the balance is going to come in terms of how people use railway, whether it's going to be more for holidays and less for work. That gives rise to all sorts of challenges, but also some decisions. And unless you understand from the passenger what, given the constraints, they really value, given the way they use trains, which is now different, you're not going to be able to tick the passenger satisfaction button.
So we've done, as part of the Great British Railways transition team, a lot of work using our colleagues from train operators on what we call a passenger revenue optimization plan that shows basically what do we think is the untapped potential in the British public for using rail and not currently using it. And guess what? One of the biggest issues is reliability. But the 4 things we identify that overwhelmingly are passenger priorities, and they vary in ranking according to where you travel from: the punctuality of your service, the ability to get a seat, the sense that you're getting a fair fare, that, in other words, that you're not being diddled, and fourthly, that if something's going wrong, that there's somebody, you get a sense that somebody's looking out for you. And actually, it's not rocket science, but if
Say
you
someone looking out for you, you mean staff on the train?
looking out for you, in other words, that somebody's trying to help you get to where you want to, either because of the personal human touch of somebody you meet, or the announcements on the train, or the information you can get in your app. Some sense that the system is working for you and not disregarding you. And that time and time again, all our research says it's those 4 things. If you're longer distance, you'll accept a 10-minute delay, but if you have to stand for 2 hours, that's really frustrating. But if actually you're in a short distance, actually punctuality really matters to you. But those 4 characteristics, time and time again, are the things that all the research says. If we could get those right,
not really rocket science, is it?
As I think, literally, I just use that phrase.
Okay, you're going to have a challenge there going forwards, because you're going to have to change how you run the trains, the frequency, what goes where when. Once you determine what the new working pattern is going to stabilise at and what the holiday pattern is going to stabilise at, how are you then going to work with that change and these expectations, because there's cost implications for that.
So the way we currently do it is we try and make sure that we're taking advice from the operators and their engagement with users and representatives of users, and they will set out where they see there are opportunities to increase passenger numbers and revenues, and we take that forward through this annual business planning round, which allows us to set those opportunities. So, for example, in the summer, a number of operators, we will look to support them running additional trains in the school holidays towards the beaches, because that is obviously an area where we know there is customer demand and there is capacity on the railway. What we need to do is sort of take that up a level through the creation of Great British Railways, have that very regionally focused railway that can really bring together, I think, both what we're seeking to do on the train operator side, but also with Network Rail to sort of maximise our ability to get the right trains in the right place through the timetabling process.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey.
Thank you very much. Sarah Owen, MP.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to follow on from some of the questions around passenger service and stakeholder engagement and workers as well, and the workforce. The first one, Mr. Bailey, you talked about some of the passenger service improvements, pay-as-you-go, mobile pay-as-you-go, GBR sales. What passenger improvements have you done for disabled passengers and people who find accessibility an issue, particularly when Scope have reported that 50% of wheelchair discounts, that discount for wheelchair users of 50% actually isn't available anywhere apart from at a ticket office, and isn't available at the automated services, and that only 45% of disabled people actually own a smartphone. So those three big things that you've just mentioned actually have no impact on disabled users at all.
So the things we're doing around accessibility, because you're absolutely right that we need to make sure that the railway works for disabled travellers. And critically as well, this is going to be, if you look at the demographics, this is going to be an issue that becomes more and more important as we go forward. So one of the things we committed to under the plan for rail was a review of station accessibility. In some ways, I'm surprised that we needed to do that, but we did. That has now been completed, as I said, making sure that is publicly available, and then allowing Andrew and other colleagues in Network Rail to use that to look at how you improve the facilities at stations. So that would be one area. The next thing we will be doing shortly is going out to consult on a national rail accessibility strategy, precisely so we hear what people actually need rather than us thinking that we know what they need. So that's the next element.
Thank you. And I think you will forgive people's frustrations about hearing that you're doing an audit of stations that they can't use, and that there will be a consultation about the stations, again, that they cannot use, given that rail access campaigners have been campaigning on this for a number of years. And I'm going to give you a really specific example of Leagrave Station in my constituency. So Luton, where I live, has 3 stations. Out of those 3 stations, only one of them has lift access. 1. Right? It's pretty shocking. Luton Town Station had been given its Access for All funding years ago. No work has started. None. Years they've been waiting. Leagrave Station has nearly 2 million journeys from it a year. Its footbridge is being held up by scaffolding currently. It's rusted. It is got holes in it. There is a disabled toilet, which very rarely works, but that doesn't matter because no disabled person can actually use that train station to get on and off the train anyway. And I have taken the rail minister there, and he has seen for himself the state of the railway. I've managed to get Network Rail, GTR, Bedfordshire Rail Access Group, the general public and Luton Borough Council to all support an Access for All bid. They put money in to have a feasibility study for lifts and improvements there. Years later, we're still waiting. This is an issue that you didn't not know about. This is an issue that you have known about for a very long time. Why is it so patchy? And why is it that rail users are waiting for so long? And all that they're getting in terms of accessibility is another questionnaire about which services they can and cannot use.
That's not what they will be getting through the consultation. They will be getting the opportunity to feed in, not only in terms of the infrastructure requirements, but also the other requirements that they may well have, so we can make sure that we are using the available funding as effectively as we can. I think what you're talking about in the case of Luton is clearly, along with all the other Access for All schemes. I don't know whether Andrew or Anit want to say anything more about Access for All.
Can I just, before you do, can I just come back and say, actually, that is what they're getting. So with the consultation, they're not seeing any action with that. When can they expect to see some action on the data that you have collected?
So once we have the that information back, we will then obviously be able to set out the strategy.
When will you get that information back? When are you expecting to have that?
So I would expect we're expecting to launch the consultation shortly, and I would expect us to get that back over towards the back end of the year.
I think Mazone's point's well made, that you can have disabled toilets or any other facilities for people, but if you can't actually get access to the train from the train to the platform or to the platform, the rest of it, even if it might be better value for money because you can spread it, doesn't really deliver, does it? So, it was Mr. Haines. Do you want Mr. Haines to come back on some of the infrastructure points? Mr. Haines.
I think the reason the access study is important is because, for me, there are 4 fundamental reasons why we're not delivering for passengers that require assistance at the moment. One is the selection of schemes isn't grounded in which ones will make the most difference. So we end up with investments which are then effectively stranded assets because you haven't got the system working as a whole. So it's really important to help with the right selection. Secondly, we tend to make vague promises without really understanding the scope. I'm absolutely not making an excuse, but the fact that the Luton station one is by the A6 means it's more expensive. But when we allocated the funding, we didn't recognise that it was because it's, you're building in a very tight, constrained area. It's going to cost more. So then we find the money hasn't gone as far as we promised to people. Thirdly, we then end up getting very involved with stakeholders, and we end up making schemes more and more expensive, and so the money goes less. And then fourthly, we as Network Rail haven't been good enough really driving it. We're really good at managing big schemes. We're doing a fabulous job on Transpire and Route Upgrade. East West Rail is bang on budget, but when it comes to small schemes like that, we historically haven't been good enough. So I'm personally leading a programme to bring that into a national portfolio so we can get the value and the economy, that we can give stakeholders better choices, and that we ground it in rational conversations about where there should be those sort of priorities. It won't fix everything. It will not increase the budget, but it does mean that we should be able to deliver more reliably and make better value of the money. I think at the moment we can do a lot better than we've been doing.
Always promise of things to come, Mr. Haines, but
time's short, so I'll move on to the workforce.
Can I just move before you do? I want to bring Mr. Stewart in on access. The Transport Committee is doing a big bit of work on this. So
yes, we're just preparing our report on our inquiry into accessibility. I just wanted to ask one very specific question. You say you are going to do this consultation on passengers with disability and other mobility needs. How are you speaking to people who just don't travel at all? People with disability, because they're just put off by the whole nightmare sometimes of travelling. How would you capture their views and needs?
The way we will obviously need to do that is, I think, working with both representatives of those groups, but also working with people like Transport Focus and others, DIPTAC, our Disabled People's Advisory Committee, to help us make sure we are hearing all the voices, because you're absolutely right. The danger is you hear the voices that are already active, and we don't spot those opportunities to really address what you need to encourage people back to the railway.
May I also make a plea that you involve other people that will have access issues, including parents. I did take my very small preschooler with me on the visit that Hugh Merriman had, just as the Minister had at Leagrave Station, to show him just how dangerous and difficult it is to navigate with a small child. It's virtually impossible with a pram. The other group is that Luton is an airport town. We have many passengers and tourists with huge amounts of luggage. This isn't just about people with this accessibility issues. This is also about people, what they're using that train station for. I'll move on to workers, because this is an issue that disabled passengers have frequently raised, that the reasons why they're not actually, it doesn't matter whether the train comes on time or not, they actually can't get on and off the train, and therefore they are not relying on public transport anymore. Over 50% feel that it is completely inaccessible to them, and largely not because of the infrastructure always, but because they don't always have reliable numbers of staff to be able to operate the ramps and the lifts. Has any implication been made, or any thoughts been made about how you're going to improve that, not just in terms of physical lifts, but in terms of staffing as well?
This is a really critical issue, and it was the point I was trying to bring out in terms of understanding what people actually need. It's not just about the infrastructure. In terms of the actions that are taking place in that space, we learnt a huge amount through the ticket office consultations. There were obviously, it was very clear that the proposals that the industry had come up with were not going to be acceptable, which is why ministers didn't take them forward. But we did get a huge amount of insight from a lot of people about what they needed at stations and how. And one of the things we are now working with ministers on is identifying what we can do to take some of that learning. So a sort of specific example, it would be when people arrive at a station, do they know where to go to find support? Is there a way of identifying a sort of welcome point or some of those things? So we're looking to really trial some of the things that came out of that, precisely to help people make sure that they can access the staff they need, because it is a very common issue that regularly comes up in complaints to operators.
We've talked a lot around about culture change and some of these big changes that are going to take place. Now, the people that are going to have to deliver this change are the staff and the rail workers. What consultations have taken place with them about what they need and what they want to see for the future of rail as well?
So, a number of things. So when Keith Williams conducted his review, he consulted very, very widely, including trade unions and workers across the railway, to make sure we really understood their perspectives. As we have taken forward reforms, we've tried to make sure we have done the same in specific areas. So we've been talking, for example, about an example would be some of the work we've done around making sure we understand how drivers can best operate trains and how onboard crew can best operate trains for passengers in a way that they when new rolling stock is coming in. I think it is an area where that dialogue with the unions is always very, very important to get that insight. Thank you.
And I will make this the last one. Mr. Conrad, you mentioned earlier about, and much earlier in the evidence session, about the Rail Reform Board, and I'm intrigued to know who makes up that board, because I wouldn't want to see the same people who have got us into this situation perpetuate the same problems, or just be it in a smaller room together. Are there people there that have specific knowledge and expertise around disability and access, or passenger groups and service, or worker representation at all?
No. So the rail reform.
On the GBRTT board, we've expressed Stephen Duckworth is a very prominent disability rights campaigner. I think he's quadriplegic himself, and he's a member of the Network Rail board, and is also a member of the GBRTT board for that. And he's been working with the team on the National Rail Accessibility Study. And he's very, very direct,
okay, that's one
as
person.
we want him to be in his feedback.
Okay, one person. Good. Mr. Bailey?
So we also we also work closely with the chair of DIPTAC as the other.
Just spell out DIPTAC.
Sorry, Disabled Passengers Transport Advisory Committee. Disabled People's Transport Advisory Committee.
Okay. And anybody from a workers' representation?
Not on the Rail Reform Board, no.
So how do you engage with the trade unions then, if they're not on the board?
So
through the normal route?
depends on the issue, either through direct dialogue or through meetings with ministers.
When was the last time the ministers or anybody from the senior members of the DFT met with the trade unions to discuss the rail reforms?
So I know that the Rail Minister has currently got invitations out with both the General Secretary of ASLEF and the RMT, and I know he is waiting for responses.
That wasn't quite the question I asked, was it?
So he is waiting to meet
No, the
them.
question I asked was when was the last time that he spoke?
So I can't answer when he last spoke to them.
We can probably find that out another route.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Dame Bernadette, do you meet with the trade unions, or Mr. Bailey? Do you?
Not regularly, no.
Mr.
So
Bailey?
I've met regularly with Unite recently.
Okay, so which bits of the service do Unite run?
So Unite was in the context of rolling stock.
Oh, okay. So in terms of the actual train drivers and guards,
That's
and
done through ministers.
Always through ministers. Okay, interesting. Thank you. In Stuart MP.
Thank you. I'd like to return to the future of rail reform. We've already touched on some of the areas I wanted to ask about. But I want to focus as well more on what is achievable without legislation and around the legislation. A lot of the evidence we have had for our scrutiny is that broadly the bill itself is welcome, but it's one piece of a much broader jigsaw. And there's still a lack of clarity as to how things like the new contracts, licenses and the like will be arranged. And that's where there's an uncertainty in the industry. When can we expect to see some of that clarity of what will sit alongside GBR when it's created?
Do you want to
Shall I pick that up? So if I start with the contractual position, we currently operate under national rail contracts. We are in the process at the moment of developing a further version of that, if you like, a national rail contract 2, which is going to be designed to further encourage that growth in revenue and passengers, and that kind of focus on the passenger experience. We expect following that to be returning to competition with passenger service contracts. We're not in a position to do that at this point for a number of reasons. The market's been extremely clear with us that they want to have real clarity on when GBR will be created, so who will the contracting body be, but they also want clarity, particularly on the industrial relations position, so they can understand the level of revenue and other risks they're willing to take. In terms of that sort of wider structure around Great British Railways and making sure that it can be held to account, we would expect following legislation to set out very clearly reforms to the GBR licence, but also see the Secretary of State use directions and guidance to really set the priorities and parameters for Great British Railways. In doing that, we'll need to work very closely with the regulator, the ORR, but also Transport Focus to make sure that passenger voice is very clearly heard. One area where we're already, for example, working with the ORR and indeed with Network Rail is around open access and how they can access the railway. So that's the private sector operators who are not contracted by DFT.
Let me just push a little further. Let's say that the rail reform bill goes through in pretty much its current guise, either just before the general election if it's later this year or very early in the next Parliament. How quickly from the passing of that piece of legislation will this broader framework be in place so that the industry has that certainty?
I think we would expect that framework to be in place in the period between the legislation passing and GBR being established. So I think we're talking probably a year to 2 years to put all those different building blocks in place, depending on what
two from now or from when.
But it's going to be informed, obviously, by what the legislation is. So we would need that new framework in place for the point when GBR comes into being. So that's the sort of the time frame.
Well, I'm guessing that once legislation is in Parliament, there are areas where we can move further than we have been able to move to date. towards sort of shadow operating status. So there are a number of things, and so once legislation is actually in Parliament, that gives much greater certainty, and we can start accelerating some of the plans on that basis. But obviously, the legislation does need to be part of the legislative session.
Of course, the online harms bill was delayed quite a lot, so you're not saying you're going to rush in the minute it's in front of the House. Because there could be delays still. I mean, especially in a year as the turmoil might be expected. Of course. Mr. Stewart.
I've one last question. The commentary around GBR is that it should be a guiding mind, and not that the head of GBR, if I can channel my childhood reading The Fat Controller out of Thomas Taggart, controlling every last aspect. But others are actually saying, no, it needs to be more of a directing mind to sort out the problems that are in the system. Between a guiding mind and a directing mind, what's the balance?
Shall I? I think those who argue very strongly for a directing mind forget that we in an increasingly devolved kingdom. The people of Scotland, the people of Wales, actually the people of London, the powers of the mayor in Manchester, West Midlands, are thus increasingly gaining mayoral powers. So the idea of a central directing mind telling all of those people what sort of rail service they can have, I think just would be wrong and wouldn't be acceptable. There are times when the network can only work if somebody takes a decision, and sometimes we see failure in the system because nobody's able to make that decision. So I think there's very rare occasions then there will be need for that sense of no, actually somebody has to make a network trade-off, but that should be absolutely the exception and not the rule. And I think those people who talk about direct in mind, I think typically tend to be quite introspective about the railway and not looking at the railway's users or the railway's political stakeholders who will want significant say in how the railway performs and the outcomes of the system.
I think that's right. And when we've worked up the kind of draft operating model, and when we've tested that, it has tended much more towards that guiding mind concept for those reasons. But there is the balance to that, which is also what customers are very clearly saying is we also know who to hold account for when things go wrong. So we've got to find the right balance between the guiding mind who is guiding, but also is prepared to stand up and take the accountability to fix those. It was one of the 4 things that Andrew talked about before.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. Anne-Marie Morris, MP.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey, 400 million has been spent. Is that just sunk cost, or is there a future value, given the uncertainty that pertains with regard to future legislation?
So I think there's future value. So examples of things that have been spent from that money. We've seen workforce reform within Network Rail, which has delivered and has helped deliver significant savings. We've done a huge amount of work to develop the future sort of operating model for the whole sector, but also for Great British Railways. So that is, that will be dependent on the legislation and going forward. But other areas that we've invested, the work around revenue recovery. I think I talked about the rail sales and some of the sort of ways of improving ticketing for passengers. I've talked about the accessibility audit. So all those things, none of those are wasted, and that's what the money has been spent on. So there's a mixture, I think, is what I'm trying to say. A lot of it has delivered real benefit that is already there. Some of it is work that will not be wasted for the future, I think, in any circumstance, but would require the legislation to really fully deliver the benefits.
The Network Rail workforce savings achieved a net saving of £775 million in the spend and review. The revenue initiatives we recognise as some north of £100 million in the spend and review period. So there are some very sizable financial benefits.
That's double. Well, if you just took Network
just
Rail,
those two alone. Well, Network Rail alone is almost double the cost. Now, obviously, not all the costs accrue to that Network Rail, and that's a cost of redundancy for effectively from.
How are you going to? How are you recording all that in so that we can?
We've got very
giving
detailed,
us that figure,
to get approval for my pay deal from the Treasury, I had to go into enormous detail. So it's very, very well articulated. Sort of all of our savings of so nearly 2,500 managers' jobs lost, but also the productivity savings with workforce.
It's just if you're making that much savings, I mean, productivity in the public sector is a challenge.
Yes.
Sounds like you have a bit of a blueprint there. I thought, can you give us a couple of real life examples of what it actually is?
Well, I mean, I've sort of taken more than 10% of the management headcount out for a start. But two things with the workforce. First of all, in the period when the railways were doing well, pay for sort of general frontline workers was rising above RPI. But actually, we've had, despite some difficult issues, we've had some good constructive relationships with trade unions, and we've managed to manage that down very differently in the post-COVID context. And we negotiated last year some fairly radical reforms to the way we do maintenance of the track, which is our single largest group of staff, over 10,000 people. And that was allowed us to offer voluntary severance to something like 1,500.
What you described so far as job losses, is that's how you've made the savings?
Job reductions, but also work reductions, which technology meant we no longer need to use people for tasks, so you can use technology instead. Out-of-date standards, which meant that assets didn't need monitoring in the same way. Changing some of our remuneration, starting signallers on starting salaries, requiring them to give us 5 months' notice, not 4 weeks' notice, so our chance to recruit and train people up meant our overtime cost is reduced. And all of that allowed us to fully fund 2 years of pay award and achieve a significant contribution back to the Treasury on a recurring basis, and all ultimately strongly supported by our colleagues in the system as an acceptable deal.
So you've been doing all of this anyway. I can't get.
No, it's very groundbreaking. I'm sorry. I don't think there's any other part of the public sector that achieved that in the current period. It was.
You're really telling me that it is about the fact that you were focused on creating Great British Railway, which has driven these savings, better work practices, and there are things you wouldn't have done in the round?
No, what I'm saying is it was a part of the government's collective agreement that, as part of progressing rail reform, the costs of the railway had to be brought under control, and a significant part of the costs are their employment costs, and therefore we had to demonstrate that we were tackling that as part of it. So it's an absolutely fundamental part. A lot of the costs of the 400 million relate to those costs.
So the overall programme had 4 key elements. It had the structural reform, of which the key element was creating Great British Railways. It had workforce reform, which Andrew's been talking about. It had this reform around fares and ticketing and the sort of passenger experience. And then it had the commercial reform that I've already talked about.
Right, thank you.
I mean, can you just point, so just before we move on, you've talked a lot about headcount reductions. Obviously, I think the notice period sounds an interesting one that maybe other bits of the public sector can learn from. But what about productivity in a more pure sense? You know, how technology's helped?
Yeah, so technology. Some of our, it's slightly embarrassing because some of our traditional working practices are really quite arcane. But previously, we had to roster teams, and yet because of previous privatisations, people might have 20 different contract terms in a team, and so you could only roster a team to the most restrictive contract term. So we've now agreed that we will individually roster people. So actually, that means we can get more productive time out of people.
Let's beg the question of why it didn't happen before.
Well, because the incentives in the system always drove people to buy peace, regardless of the price. Bluntly, and it's only the post-COVID financial stretch and strain on the system has said, hang on, we are building in unnecessary and unsustainable costs into the system, and that's why I'm very pleased that our colleagues voted overwhelmingly for that, albeit at the end of industrial action. They ultimately supported that package as the right thing in terms of giving them sustainable jobs and ultimately better jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Bedlake.
Thank you, Chair. Dame Bernadette, I've been quite interested to read a little bit of the history of various rail reviews over time, and note that there have been a series actually in the last 20 years or so which have identified many of the problems that we've been discussing today. The department's Future of Rail white paper back in 2004, when I started secondary school, identified issues with a lack of accountability and clear strategic direction, amongst other things. Then in 2011, we had the Realising the Potential of GB Rail, which identified an insufficient focus on the needs of customers. Then in 2012, Reforming Our Railways, Putting the Customer First white paper came along. And then in 2016, the Shaw report identified frustration with the quality and reliability of passenger services and a perceived lack of accountability in the railway system. Many of these things then were again touched in the 2021 review. So why do you think it is the case that these historic reviews failed to lead to the improvements on many of these issues?
I confess I haven't done a deep history lesson on all of these reports, quite a number of which, with the exception of Shaw, they all predate me, although I could give you a few more reviews, not listed in the NAA report, which have happened as well, because there have been a lot of these over time. I mean, I think, and Andrew will have lots of thoughts on this as well, so as will Conrad, I'm sure. But I mean, thoughts I would have is, firstly, not all of these reviews haven't always looked at the whole of the railway in its entirety as a system. Certainly when Nicola Shaw looked at, did her review, she was focused very much on Network Rail's performance. I think if we're going to improve the performance of the railway, both financially and for passengers, you have to look at the whole system, which is what Keith Williams did, and which is how our current reform programme is focused. I think the other thing is, in a sense, the financial pressures have definitely driven a stronger focus. They've always been there, but they've been hidden at various points for a significant period of time. Network Rail was not on the public balance sheet, and therefore we sort of didn't concern ourselves with its costs the way that we do now, and we have to, and that Andrew has to now. Similarly, for a period of time, and even I can even briefly remember this, train operating revenues were going up and up, and there was a significant surplus relative to costs. So again, the sort of incentives really to look at both revenue growth and costs weren't there. And then of course the third thing is pandemic and the way it's changed people's travel patterns, and therefore again also required us to look again at whether the railway that we now have is fit for purpose given the way that people are travelling. So I think there are a number of factors really which have brought this into much sharper relief, and which I hope means that we will now have that this is a sustained programme, and that we will be driving reform to some genuinely significant outcomes for passengers and taxpayers.
Mr. Haines.
I think Bernadette absolutely nailed the two key things for me, which the first is that I don't think any of those reviews actually looked at the system as a whole, and secondly, most of them were done in the second decade of this century when the railways were on continuous growth, and so some of the underlying financial challenges were being masked by a headline growth number, and as a consequence of that, the railway was becoming more and more congested, and so governments of both Labour and Conservative governments have been investing in the system, and then find, hang on, we don't get the return for our investment because the fragmentation in the system means I can't rely on putting in £10 and getting £15 back over the life of the asset because of all the different players. So I think the underlying growth of the economy and the shift of people to use the railway was masking some of the problems, which were then super exposed by the congestion effect when we saw some of that investment, which had been a long time in the north, around the Manchester area, and then with the Thameslink programme, really exposed the fact the system can't actually promise to deliver in return for the taxpayers' input, because the system actually doesn't function as a system, it functions as a series of different actors at the moment, and that hadn't been exposed in any of those other reviews because it wasn't looking at the system. I hope that's not too
just
railway an answer, but
just if I can just ask for a bit of clarification on the point that in those years when revenues were increasing, we didn't find that incentive to introduce any reform or make changes to improve the service, and yet all the way back in 2004 issues were raised in terms of the cost and performance and the relationship between the infrastructure provider and those operating on the train. So forgive me, I'm missing a little bit about what it was that they weren't looking at the entire system when in 2004 they were looking at performance, they were looking at the relationship between train operating companies and the infrastructure.
Well,
Forgive me,
2004 was at the start of an entirely brand new structure. That was the time. That was immediately after an Act of Parliament that removed something called the Strategic Rail Authority and vested the franchising powers into the Department for Transport. So that I feel like that was a sort of day one assessment of what needed doing. Then 2011, Roy McNulty was asked to do a review that said, look, the costs of the system are greater than they ought to be. Other railways run more efficiently. But my point was the imperative to look at that was slightly masked by the fact the top revenue line was covering those costs. As Bernadette has said, actually, despite that excessive cost, the effect on the taxpayer was declining subsidy on the railway because actually the top revenue line was going. So that's why it's, if you like, it took the imperative out of the system because the numbers were still balancing themselves.
Okay, and so does it then follow that due to the fact that we now have, for want of a better way of putting it, less money, we need to look at it? Necessity is the mother of invention, as it were. And that's why you're more confident that this round of reform will be more successful, whereas the previous rounds...
Absolutely. It's a system, root and branch. There's a financial imperative to take action, and that's one of the things which has driven workforce reform, because it shifted the incentive to say, no, we have to take that action, created a different narrative with the workforce. And at the same time, governments are still wanting to invest in the railway, which is exciting, but it means they really want to be confident they're going to be able to realise the benefits. Not much point in Mr. Francois getting his Ely scheme if nobody can actually utilise it then, because we can't, the guided mind can't engineer the additional capacity, because that capacity is only released for those services if it works through Birmingham and if it works through Manchester for those freight trains.
Yes, sir, but for the record, I'd be delighted if you could just deliver it and then we can argue
about
it afterwards.
But this is the point. Treasury are increasingly cynical about rail investment if we can't deliver the end user benefits.
Yes.
And understandably so, rightly so, on behalf of the
might be with the Treasury on that point, end user benefits.
But you pointed out I am as well if we're not able to avoid the system. That wasn't a complaint about the Treasury. They're rightly saying...
I wouldn't complain about the Treasury with the Treasury Officer of Accounts sitting next to you. Probably not a wise move. No, can I just go back to the point that was raised earlier? Various people talked about stakeholder engagement, and we briefly touched on trade union engagement, and it was interesting, and I think surprised us all a bit that Mr. Bailey and Permanent Secretary, you don't meet with the trade unions regularly. It's a matter for ministers. There must have been a time at which officials met with trade unions just as a matter of course. It does happen. I know it has happened in other departments at different times. Was there a step change at any point where it became?
I think the relationship with the trade unions in recent years has principally been managed through employers, through Andrew, in the case of his employees, and through train operators in the case of theirs. And so they are the sort of main point of dialogue. And I think that's been true for certainly the time I've been in the department.
Which is, remind us, 7...
I've been 7 years in this role, and then about 18 months before that doing DG rail role. So I don't think it's particularly... and there have always been, at points of dispute, which obviously we've had industrial relations disputes, ministers may then offer to meet unions, and that has happened, but clearly where it's not obvious that progress is being made, that dialogue doesn't continue.
But Mr. Bailey, when good policy is made involving stakeholders, whether you agree with people's points of view or not, you need to know what the practical realities are on the ground, and what issues you may arise with different stakeholders, so you know whether you're going to have a challenge or not, whatever you propose. So wouldn't it just be normal to have that kind of conversation at the point at which you're shaping policy and developing it? Rather, I can see at the dispute end there might be, we can put that to one side for a moment, but in terms of shaping good policy, would it not be good?
Absolutely, and when we were developing the policy, Keith Williams, who was leading the review, engaged, supported by DfT officials, engaged very broadly, including with the trade unions, user reps, people who may not have travelled, a really huge range of people, which I think was set out in the white paper. So that absolutely did happen.
Okay, well, Zoe, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so when was that Williams review?
So that was Keith did his work between 2018 and 2021.
Okay, so we're looking at potentially 3 years of no conversations between DfT staff and the actual representatives of the rail workers.
Ministers have met.
Ministers have, but
yes.
but you can't tell me when because it was quite a while ago. But
Check and
it would be great to get back to me.
Yeah.
But these, if I get my understanding of the chair's concerns, these huge rail reforms are going to be delivered by the staff that are on the ground day in, day out, and there is a lack of communication between yourselves directly and them and their representative bodies.
So the reforms we're talking about here, I think we're talking about very much reforms within, I guess, head office functions. We've certainly talked to, for example, DFT trade unions in this regard. I'm sure Andrew's talked to Network Rail trade unions. What we haven't done, and Bernadette was very clear about this, is we have not routinely engaged with the rail unions at official level. That has tended to be done through ministers.
Can you see why that seems a bit strange, since when we've talked about stakeholder engagement, you're prepared to talk to every other stakeholder, including disability groups, but not the actual workers' groups? Can you see that there's a difference there? Why is that difference?
As I say, we have tended to do that through ministerial engagement. I am very happy to engage with any stakeholders. I always learn more, and you're much better able to understand people's perspectives.
Okay. Do you think you'd be allowed to do that then in future, perhaps, to be able to engage with
Is there any
stakeholders?
prohibition on you meeting
Yeah.
trade unions?
I don't think it's prohibition, but I mean, obviously, while there's live disputes, these things have the risk that meetings become politicised is greater. And I think it is more difficult, therefore, to have sort of, as it were, business as usual type dialogues. I would say that.
Okay, well, we hear what we think. I think we've taken you as far as you can go as a matter we may raise with ministers. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time. I think Mr. Haines summed up the Holy Grail, which doesn't sound very ambitious, but is I think most passengers would be happy with the punctuality, getting a seat, a fair fare, and having someone there or someone in the system able to help, be it staff or other routes. So. I think roll on the day that happens. If that's the ambition, let's hope that can be achieved. And I think we all recognise that without legislation, even with legislation, it's still going to take some time to deliver, and then we have a complication or potentially of a general election in the middle of it. So we wish you well, because we want all our constituents to have a good experience on the railways. And we will obviously, we're now at the point of saying it's our successor committee that will come to talk to you about this. Don't worry, I'm leaving them a detailed note. So
there's no money.
Yes, you have to do a subject access request to see what I say about you. So thank you very much indeed for the time. The transcript of this session will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and we'll probably be publishing a report at some point after the Whitsun recess. Thank you very much indeed. Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.